Somewhere right now, a farmer in Indonesia is selling rice. He'll be paid in Indonesian rupiah. He'll spend in rupiah. He'll live his whole life in rupiah. And he has never once thought about the US dollar. But the price of that rice, the fertilizer that grew it, the ship that will carry it, the fuel that powered that ship, every single one of those things was priced in dollars first. He just doesn't know it. That's the dollar. Invisible, everywhere, inescapable. And the story of how that happened and why it's still happening is one of the strangest, most consequential accidents in economic history. Here's a number that sounds boring until you really think about it. Roughly 58% of all foreign exchange reserves held by central banks around the world are in US dollars. Not gold, not euros, not yuan, dollars. The euro comes in second at around 20%. The yuan, despite China's enormous economy and decades of effort to internationalize it, sits at under 3%. In 2024, roughly 88% of all currency trades in the world involved the US dollar on at least one side. And the US share of global GDP? About 25%. So the world's largest economy accounts for a quarter of global output, but it dominates nearly 9/10 of global currency transactions. That is not a coincidence. That is a system, a designed system. And it was built in a small New Hampshire hotel in 1944. July 1944. World War II is still being fought, but 44 Allied nations are already planning for the peace. They meet at the Mount Washington Hotel in Mount Washington, New Hampshire. The goal: build a financial system that prevents another Great Depression, because the old system, where countries competed to devalue their currencies, triggering trade wars, unemployment, and eventually actual wars, had been catastrophic. The man with the plan was John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist alive. He wanted to create a new international currency, something neutral, something no single country controlled. He lost. Harry Dexter White, representing the United States, which at that moment held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, had a different proposal. Simple, clean, devastating in its elegance. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. The U.S. would guarantee you could exchange dollars for gold at any time. The world, exhausted and broke, agreed. And just like that, the dollar became the world's reserve currency. Let's talk about what a reserve currency actually does, because it's not just about trade. When countries trade with each other, they need a common language, not French or Mandarin, a financial language, a shared unit of account that everyone trusts. Oil, the most traded commodity on Earth, is almost entirely priced in dollars. Even when Japan buys oil from Saudi Arabia, a trade that doesn't involve the United States at all, it happens in dollars. Why? Partly history, partly network effects, and partly because of a deal made in 1974. After Nixon broke the Bretton Woods system in 1971, we'll get to that, the U.S. was scrambling. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. Why would anyone hold it? So the U.S. cut a deal with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would price their oil exclusively in dollars. In return, the U.S. would provide military protection and buy Saudi oil. The rest of OPEC followed. The petrodollar was born. Now, if you're a country that needs oil, and every country needs oil, you need dollars, which means you need to earn dollars, which means you need to trade in ways that generate dollars, which ties you to the dollar system whether you want to be or not. Here's where it gets strange. The dollar runs what economists call an exorbitant privilege, a term ironically coined by a French finance minister in the 1960s as a complaint. Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, everyone needs dollars. And because everyone needs dollars, the U.S. can borrow money at lower interest rates than any other country, permanently. The U.S. national debt is over $34 trillion, and yet it pays interest rates that countries with far smaller debts can only dream of. Because when the world gets nervous, a financial crisis, a pandemic, a war, people don't flee the dollar, they run toward it. In 2008, when U.S. banks nearly collapsed the global financial system, the dollar got stronger. Let that sit for a moment. The country at the center of the crisis saw its currency appreciate while everyone else scrabbled to get more of it. That is a structural advantage with no real parallel in history. And it has a cost, but that cost is paid by other people. When the U.S. prints dollars, which it has done aggressively since 2008 and even more aggressively since 2020, it exports inflation. Because dollars are held globally, the inflationary pressure gets diluted across every country holding them. Americans effectively get to spend money that the rest of the world partially funds. That French minister wasn't wrong. It is exorbitant. Now, here's the part they don't put in textbooks. The system has a fundamental design flaw. It was identified in 1960 by a Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin, and it's been slowly playing out ever since. It works like this. If the dollar is the world's reserve currency, the world constantly needs more dollars. The only way to supply more dollars to the world is for the U.S. to run trade deficits, to buy more than it sells, pumping dollars into the global economy. But if the U.S. runs large, persistent trade deficits, it hollows out its own industrial base, it accumulates debt, and eventually people start to wonder if those dollars are actually worth what they claim to be worth. The more successful the dollar is as a reserve currency, the more it undermines the economic conditions that made it trustworthy in the first place. This is called the Triffin dilemma, and there's no clean solution. Nixon discovered this the hard way. By 1971, other countries, France in particular, were lining up to exchange their dollars for U.S. gold. The reserves were draining fast, so Nixon did something radical. He ended the gold convertibility, just closed the window. The Bretton Woods system was dead. The dollar survived anyway, which tells you something important about how these systems work. They persist not because of formal agreements, but because of inertia, network effects, and the simple fact that there's nothing good enough to replace them. Every few years, a new story emerges. The dollar is dying. China is taking over. BRICS will create a new reserve currency. The petrodollar is finished. In 2023, Brazil and Argentina announced they were exploring a common currency for South American trade. Saudi Arabia made noise about accepting yuan for oil. The BRICS summit talked loudly about reducing dollar dependence. None of it has materially moved the needle. Here's why. Creating an alternative to the dollar isn't a political decision, it's an engineering problem. You need deep, liquid financial markets. You need a legal system that credibly protects property rights. You need investors around the world to trust that they can put billions into your assets and get them out again. The U.S. has all of that. The U.S. Treasury market is the largest, most liquid market on Earth. There are $26 trillion in treasuries outstanding. You can buy or sell billions of dollars worth in minutes. The Chinese yuan, China still has capital controls. You can't freely move money in and out, which means it cannot function as a global reserve currency, almost by definition. The euro comes in closest, but Europe doesn't have a single sovereign bond market. There's no euro bond. There's German debt and Italian debt and Greek debt, and they are emphatically not the same thing. De-dollarization is real at the margins. The dollar's share of reserves has declined from 71% in 2000 to 58% today. That's not nothing, but it's also taken 24 years. Step back for a moment. The dollar's dominance is simultaneously the most boring and the most consequential geopolitical fact in the world. It means the U.S. can sanction countries, cutting them off from the dollar system in ways that inflict enormous pain without firing a single shot. Russia learned this in 2022. Iran has lived it for decades. It means the U.S. foreign policy has a financial lever that no other country possesses. It means that when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to fight American inflation, countries around the world feel the aftershock. Their currencies weaken, their dollar-denominated debts become more expensive. Inflation in Des Moines becomes a financial crisis in